Hi, this is Dr. Randy Bach. I'm here today with a conversation with uh, Houman Hemmati, MD, PhD. He's, I believe, out in the LA area. He's become rather an interesting follow of mine on Twitter. He posts on COVID items, on medical freedom, personal freedom, and so forth. I probably got your name slightly wrong. I apologize for that. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've been able to navigate our last crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Randy, so much for having me on. Pleasure to be here and good to meet you, and virtually at least. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm an MD, like you said, but I'm also a PhD, and I focused most of my time in biomedical research with an emphasis on clinical trials, including on adults as well as in children. And so I'm well versed in a lot of these issues of informed consent, as well as analysis of medical data that have become something that most people were unaware of at all before COVID hit, and now are able to cite and interpret better than some experts can. And many don't know how to, but they think they can. And so that's where some of the problems arise. I never intended to become a voice for anything in the public sphere. I had always been a private person, focused, just doing my work, helping try to, advance lives, advance vision, and help other people, really. And then when COVID hit, the world really changed, and I realized that there were a lot of policies being enacted, whether that be school shutdowns, whether that be various kinds of societal lockdowns, mandates, et cetera, that were really causing a lot of harm with no risk-benefit analysis, and also taking away individual freedoms. And then over the last few years, I've watched it get even worse as people have been silenced, censored, shamed, ridiculed, and excluded from society, not even for going against what's been said and done, but simply for questioning it. And I found really a duty on my end to try to stand up for that, and try to encourage open dialogue, encourage questioning of what we believe is true, and to try to advocate for individual freedom above all else.
Well, that's kind of right up my alley. I think that I try to reiterate that science is really two things. Science is a body of knowledge, and science is a scientific process. And for quite some time, Al Gore at one point, the science is settled. That's an inimical, contradictory, oxymoronic, and moronic phrase, because science is never settled. Even Newtonian physics, which for the most part we live in our world as of Newtonian physics, is not settled, and it didn't become settled. It was overturned, and the whole idea of science is a matter of questioning, and the lack of ability to do so is hugely deleterious to to advancing what we actually know and operate by, the rules, and it's a horrible imposition on our freedoms.
I totally agree, and this whole concept of there being the science, and listening to people who start their sentences with phrases like "science says," is completely false. Like, true scientists who actually do this for a living never say those comments, right? What they say is recent studies have suggested, or studies have shown the likelihood that, and then they'll say what they plan to say, but they'll never go and make these definitive assertions in such a way that everything else must be false. And when you hear that, I think that should set off some alarm bells in your mind, because whoever is uttering those things either doesn't know what they're talking about, or really thinks they know too much and is willing to silence everyone else around them. And those things are dangerous.
I agree. So take us a little bit in your own personal path. What have been the upsides, the downsides? How have you, I assume you've had some of the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune thrown your way, because from what I understand, you are not afraid to speak your mind and discuss recent studies and so forth, rather than just apply, or follow sort of a misapplied dogma.
Yeah, what I've tried to do all along, and I think it's part of the reason why I've avoided getting thrown into the mud pit of politics, is to avoid shaming or naming or criticizing even individuals, but rather focusing on policy. So I don't go after individuals, I don't go after political parties, I don't go after organizations per se. I try to be critical of policies, of decisions, of language that's been used, regardless of who's saying it, and to
Mhm.
focus on those things. And so by doing so, I think I've avoided a lot of the controversy. I think there are certain news outlets that tend to not censor, that tend to be more willing to, air ideas like mine or yours, and those have oftentimes been associated with certain political angles, for better or for worse.
Mhm.
I think it's unfortunate that a lot of the traditional legacy media has been, up until very recently, or even now, unwilling to hear any alternative opinions. And so, what's been happening is that a lot of people who have been free thinkers, who have been pro individual freedom, have been labeled falsely as right wingers, or favoring a particular president over another, etc. And that's really, it's harmed the conversation, and it's been nothing further from the truth, right? You have a lot of people, irrespective of their political beliefs or backgrounds or any political affiliation at all right, who are all joined together and unified around this one idea that we need to have an open dialogue and freedom. And what's happened is you see a lot of people who had previously identified as members of one political party who were now, as they call themselves, politically homeless. Many people who now have abandoned what they considered the progressive political ideologies and moved more toward the center, or even toward what they consider the political right, and others who just don't care anymore about politics, right? Who really are now focused on what are the policies, and I think that's where we should be. I think we should be looking at what are people's policies, what are they saying, and criticize that, because what you realize is that nobody is totally right. And I think once we have a departure from this division along party or partisan lines, or even among which network you like to watch, all of a sudden you become a more open thinker and you begin to become critical of everything around you. And I think there's nothing healthier than that.
Right. Well, I agree with you. I mean, just on my last episode, I mentioned that a lot of my friends classify themselves, and I'm wondering whether I qualify as a JFK liberal. That in the era of JFK,
Yeah.
you would be a liberal, but it's not so much one's views change. My wife is a professor of the classics, Roman and Greek, and history and so forth, and she's always got an example. A lot of these divisions and problems are not new. They're part of the human condition.
Yeah.
And some of it has not so much to do left, right, so forth, as in and out, or in power, up and down, who's in power, who's not in power. And I think one of the commonalities of people in power is they like power, or else they would be doing something else, perhaps. And some of these things I think have align with keeping and maintaining power, and not necessarily spreading that out, right or wrong. And I think part of the human mentality is you have a decision, and then if you're wrong, not necessarily own up to it. I don't know if you found any of that going on, and do you get your frustration? I mean, it's good to be kind of above the fray, as you are in a sense, but you must have to engage at certain points. I mean, there are, I think, political flashpoints that do fall along party lines, or left right kind of sensibilities.
Of course, and when that happens, I call it out, right? And you've seen, in California, Governor Gavin Newsom, for example, who has really tried to make his policies of censorship, of almost authoritarian rule, become emblematic of his political party. I think that's wrong. I think the Democratic Party historically has not been one that has been marked by any aspect of authoritarianism. It's been one that's focused on certain taxation policies, for example, and certain social policies, but has never really been one that's focused on overt government control. If anything, historically, the Democratic Party has wanted to have individual freedom, and has shied away from having government control over people's bodies, or so they claim. What's happening now is that we have a handful of leaders who, for their own political purposes, right, for the purpose of advancing their own political power, where they currently are, as well as their future political ambitions. And it's clear that Governor Newsom has presidential ambitions, based on a lot of his recent actions, regardless of what he says. They're taking steps to try to consolidate power, and to try to define themselves and define even their own political party by a new set of ideologies that weren't there before. And
Mhm.
what I think, to some degree, it's worked because it's strengthened their grip on the people they're ruling now. But at the same time, I also think long term it's going to backfire, because people, especially people in American society, have a desire to have freedom, and will always gravitate toward individual freedom, regardless of where it's coming from. And if there are people who are spewing authoritarianism, ultimately that will backfire. And I think we're seeing some examples of that with a lot of the political shifts that we've seen in recent elections. And I think there's a lot more of that to come.
So the thing that is on my mind is Bill, if I have the numbers correct, 2098 in California. And I'm wondering what exactly that is. Maybe you could tell our viewers a little bit about it, because not everyone here is Californian. Is it enacted already? How is it playing out? What are the challenges to it? And what does it mean for general medical care if doctors have to spout a state line?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about this. This is one issue that I've been quite passionate about, and there are a large number of physicians, as well as non-physicians, community activists, regular citizens, and thankfully lawyers who know how to navigate the legal system, who are now challenging AB 2098 in court. AB 2098 is a COVID medical misinformation bill that was signed by Gavin Newsom, the governor, in the late fall of 2022, and became law just a handful of days ago when we had the new year. And what AB 2098 does is it threatens the medical license of any physician who is believed to be giving COVID misinformation to their patients during their care in a manner that causes harm. And what the definition of COVID misinformation is, according to the text of AB 2098, is anything that goes against the generally accepted scientific consensus. What does that mean? That means whatever they say it is, really, because there is no exact definition. And that's in part because the definition in science constantly evolves. But they want to set these arbitrarily goalposts so they can arbitrarily censor or even delete individual physicians based on what they say. Now, there's been a little bit of a misunderstanding among the public in terms of what AB 2098 can do. It cannot go after a physician for what they say in the media, on social media, in private conversations, or to people who are not their own patients, who are under their specific care, right? This is really one that's about a physician and their patient who's under their care. And it does technically require there to be some sort of harm. I don't think it's too early to have seen anyone be prosecuted based on the text of this law, but I can envision there being people who begin to whistleblow on physicians who are willing to write vaccine or mask exemption documents for people who are willing to attribute certain medical problems that patients have, perhaps to one of the various COVID mitigation factors, doctors who may have a risk-benefit decision with a patient and in which they recommend perhaps not getting a vaccination because the current data don't show that the risk-benefit profile works in favor of getting a vaccine, right? And I can envision those things happening. Those conversations are really meant to be private between a physician and their patient, and they're meant to be customized, individualized based on what the physician understands of the patient's background. And ultimately, they're not meant for the physician to make any decision on behalf of the patient. They're made for the physician to give their own patient informed consent so the patient could decide ultimately what's best for themselves based on an understanding of the risks, benefits, and alternatives. AB 2098 is really meant to scare physicians into not even having those conversations by threatening their license, by saying, you know what, if a patient goes to the medical board and reports you and says, you know what, you didn't, you said things that they believe to be false, the government can come after you. And I think this is frightening because when you think about it, a physician is, of all people, is supposed to be free to give their opinion, their interpretation of what the scientific facts are, right? And this is why we have this concept of a second opinion. There's no such thing as a second fact, right? You shouldn't even have a second opinion if there were such a thing as absolute settled science. right? The reason why we get second opinions, third opinions, is that each physician may interpret things differently. And this is why patients are free to see multiple physicians to get different opinions. By saying that there's only one correct opinion and it's whatever the governor says is outlandish. And there are multiple lawsuits against this right now, a couple of big ones that have been filed already with some great plaintiffs who I know who are also very active in the community here. And I'm confident that on First Amendment grounds alone, this is going to be struck down, because it's
Well,
tough to imagine that any court will uphold this.
Yeah, I had Dr. Aaron Cariati on about 5-6 weeks ago, and I believe he's working against this.
Correct.
It's just, horrible situations. I am completely in accord with what you're saying. I see patients on a part-time basis right now in primary care, and there are 5 states, I believe, in the country that maintain mask mandates for outpatient physician offices. Even if you're seeing a dermatologist or something like that, and nobody's sick, or a podiatrist or whatever. I went to the dentist today, and maybe you could make a better argument for dentistry, but everybody's masked for every problem. So if I saw a 9-year-old with an elbow problem, and his say 38-year-old dad together, and nobody's sick, both healthy, both relatively young in the greater scheme of things, and everyone's masked. Doctor, patient, and it's not like you can't see somebody's elbow that way, but there's a detraction from the encounter, from getting to know the patient and being able to see visual cues. There's a comfort level for a 9-year-old to just have everybody be anonymous. We're having a face-to-face interview. I suppose we could, have cut this down. I think it'd be less interesting for the viewers for obvious reasons. We are reading faces. That's kind of like, I think, a good fraction of our cerebral cortex is there just to recognize faces and emotions and moods and all that kind of stuff. It's hard for me to tell, what is the underlying problem. There's a thing in medicine called, you've probably heard of this doorknob syndrome, where the doctor, we talk about whatever, the wart on your shoulder or something like that. The doctor touches the doorknob. It's like, oh, doctor, by the way. And there's that moment where they talk about the other problem. Maybe it's sexual or psychological. Or
what they were actually there for.
Yeah, emotional. And I think you don't get that moment of where you're going to trust the doctor, trust this guy or gal or PA, whatever it is, if they're masked. You just haven't made that bond. That's my own personal feeling about it. And yet, I think California is one of those states. I think it's actually Washington State and 4 Northeast states, the ones that have it. California has a modified version for everybody except children. So they have almost the same rule about masking. And so if you're going to look at the science of what misinformation is, it's very state by state thing. The Dakotas at one point had different masking regulations, North and South Dakota, and they're hard to tell. They're almost the same shape and same geography, same demographic, all that kind of stuff. And one had masks and one didn't. Now which one's acting scientifically? Well, in fact, as a binary star, they're acting scientifically together because you can do experimentation. But this concept that in the midst of a pandemic, for instance, that you can actually discern and parse out science the only way to do science is to have experimentation in individual cases, clinical trials repetitively and all that kind of stuff with controls. You can't do that in a population case and in the pandemic. So the whole concept of having, science in this type of arrangement is really, a mirage. And then, obviously by extension, you could put this for other things that the state might see as having an interest, whether it's, our current, the gender dysphoria realm, or any other things that kind of parse along are split along political lines in a sense. The state will have a way of quashing doctors. And so then the getting back to the original thing about, what is science and whether science is settled. We always hear that 97% of scientists say X, and you can't disagree with them. Well, I think we have a sense now why 98% of any group says something, because there are pressures if you don't. And so to that point, have you felt pressures to say or not say things? And how have you, on a personal basis, for you and your family, navigated this whole morass, say, of regulations, restrictions, vaccinations, and so forth, if you care to touch on any of that?
Yeah. So first, with respect to backlash, my answer is no. And I think it's largely because I'm respectful to people, and I'm respectful to people I disagree with. So I won't go and attack them or call names or make ad hominem attacks on people. If I disagree, I'll do so politely. And I think what I see in return is that people tend to disagree with me politely. And on those rare occasions when they don't, what happens is people come to my defense. So I don't really have to do anything. And those people usually will shut up, because ultimately, when you have an open discussion, like Twitter's been opened recently after the Elon Musk takeover, what you see is that people who spew nonsense or hatred or things that just are embarrassing end up becoming embarrassed because they're allowed to say these silly things, and then they'll either just self-censor because they're clearly not getting any traction, or people will pile on top of them. And so I think that the system kind of works well when there's a very free and open exchange of ideas. And so I think by being respectful, being focused on facts, being focused on core ethical principles, I may be wrong at times. I will admit when I'm wrong, and I'm frequently wrong, in fact, but I like to get feedback from people. I appreciate when people write to me individually or even comment and say, hey, here's why I think you're wrong. Maybe you should consider editing your comment. I love that kind of feedback, right? Because that's how I learn. That's how I improve. At the same time, I think when people, make sorts of attacks, they just make themselves look dumb, and ultimately, they don't get any traction. And so when you have, like I said, an open dialogue like you now do on Twitter, you begin to settle out the junk from the good.
I agree with you, and I admire that. I aspire to that. I think I'm probably more polarizing than you are. I probably run a little bit more, hot and cold, perhaps. And it's I grew up kind of in a pretty argumentative family. We loved each other, but we argued, and it just always seemed natural. When I met and married my wife, I think a lot of her family was kind of like in a very tighter bandwidth of emotions, and so be it. I kind of get things in my mind, they get over them, and their method. I don't want to be quoted here, but I think they tend to brew and stew a little bit over things more. I think discussion is the way we kind of make decisions. And I appreciate, and actually, I sense what you're saying about yourself, and I think that's really important. But there were times. I mean, you mentioned the change in Twitter. There are times during which it felt like we were kind of swimming in a tunnel, and either end didn't seem necessarily accessible, and there's the possibility of drowning in the middle. So there are times during our lockdowns and in other countries, which I think experienced it worse than we did. Australia, New Zealand, countries are allies. The ones we went to wars with, and we saw as kind of the Anglophone democracy, the bastions of democracy, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I think they turned. They had a very, they basically had, as parliamentary systems, they had tyranny of the majority in a sense, and they were able to do kind of lock things down, so kids couldn't go swimming, kids could go skate. I mean, here we had a lot of that too, but it was worse in terms of the ability or the inability to actually have that expression. And I'm assuming, making an assumption from your name, Houman David, that I'm imagining you're from Iran, and
yes.
There are places out there where people can't have the free discussion. And I assume your family came here to get that. I'm wondering whether that gives you a perspective on a lot of people appreciate democracy the best, or when I say democracy, I mean open discussion and say Republican representative freedom and so forth, are people from, say, behind the Iron Curtain, such as it was, and in other situations where they actually had genuine repression. So during the times that we had, aspects of that, how do you maintain equanimity and hope and the kind of the freshness of your thoughts and generosity?
Oh, well, I think, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about, the immigrant background. When you look at the people who were out there the most, who are the most vocal, who've been fighting a lot of this nonsense since it began in March of 2020 up until now, a lot of them have names like mine, right? A lot of them are immigrants. A lot of them are people who were here from outside the U.S. who came to the U.S. specifically seeking freedom, and people who have a perspective, who understand, even if they didn't come from an authoritarian dictatorship, nonetheless, came here because they had this notion of achieving the American dream. And part of the American dream involves almost full freedom, right? Freedom to say and do as you want, as long as it's not going to overtly harm somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're also the most sensitive to those freedoms being jeopardized or taken away, because we know exactly what it can be like on the other side. We've been there, we've seen it, and we know how quickly freedoms can be lost. When I was born in Iran, it was pre-revolution, and when I was a kid, the revolution occurred, and all of a sudden, a country that was very free for the most part, very open, people were allowed to say what they wanted. They were allowed to sing and dance and congregate and go on dates and whatever. All of a sudden, those freedoms were gone in a matter of days. All right. And so we know how fragile freedom is, and we know that you have to sometimes really stand up and fight for it. Fight doesn't mean using violence. It just means getting people around you to become aware of what's happening, and to do something about it, or to simply not even comply when the government rules become outlandish. And so you see that happening, right? And they're very, it's a disproportionate number of people who were from other parts of the world who were actually leading the charge to try to bring some sanity to the COVID debate and discussion nationally. And I think that's important, right? I think that's part of the advantage of having immigrants in this country, especially those who really escaped from tyranny themselves, is that we do bring that perspective here. Because once you're here and once you've grown up here or been here for generations, you begin to sometimes take things for granted. You begin to assume that freedom is a constant, but it's not, right? Freedom is really something that I think any government is going to ultimately want to take away, right? As you said, the people who go into power are people who like power, and people who are in power like to maintain power, and they can most easily do that by putting controls on the people. And so it's up to the people to constantly be keeping the government in check, to be sure that they don't overextend those controls and those powers over the people, so that we maintain that balance where you have a government that does its job, but at the same time allows the people to have individual freedom. When I saw that, our local beaches here in Los Angeles were fenced off, and you had armed police guarding them, so that you couldn't, for a period of several months, go to the beach without getting arrested. There's a problem with that. Now, I badly wanted to go to the beach, and so I dressed like a homeless person. I actually deliberately, as an experiment, decided to see what it would be like if I pretended to be homeless, because in Los Angeles, homeless are basically immune from prosecution for almost every crime. And so I decided to do an experiment. And so I dressed like a homeless person, and I'd grown out a long beard, as many did during COVID. And I went down to the beach in Santa Monica. And guess what? I snuck around the fence in full view of the police. And for the first and probably only time in my life, I had the entirety of Santa Monica Beach all to myself, because no one else was around there. It was fenced off.
Oh my
and when
God.
you see something like that happening, you realize how crazy it's gotten. In Malibu, which is not too far from us, there was a lone paddleboarder, a guy who just went in the middle of the ocean paddleboarding away from any other humans. And right, they sent a police boat, right, with lights and everything on, and they arrested this person. They pulled him out of the water, handcuffed him, and took him away, because this guy posed a danger to people around him. In my own neighborhood, people stopped walking in the sidewalk for fear of getting COVID by passing someone else. And so people started walking in the middle of the street. Well, they haven't stopped walking in the middle of the street. And so you get people who get constantly are at risk of getting run over by a car, because even though there's a perfectly good sidewalk right there, they walk in the middle of the street. The problem is everyone else is doing the same. And so now your chance of walking past another person is actually higher when you walk in the middle of the street. It makes no sense, but people continue to do those things out of habit at this point. And the worst, I think, is what they did to the kids. There's so many kids now who've gotten conditioned, little kids who are 3 or 4 years old, who've spent the vast majority of their lives masked by force, who don't know it any other way, and who now won't leave home unless a mask is put on their face. They want the mask. They demand it, not because they are trying to protect themselves from a virus. That's not why. It's only because that they don't know any other way. They're, like a dog that's been trained to ask, for its collar or leash to be put on when they walk out of the house. The same exact thing has happened to little kids. It's tragic, and I think it's frankly criminal.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on target there. I'm just gonna, only because on the top of my head, I apologize, but I was at the dentist today, as I mentioned. I mentioned, I was asking the office about their masking, and they're working under state control, so there was really very little discussion there. But previously they hadn't. I mean, the dentist always wore one because he's the dentist. He's working on you. But we traded stories, and I was mentioning, we should have names for the various phases of our recent past. But one of the dark episodes of COVID, everyone's kind of zombified a little bit, and my street's pretty wide street. It's quiet. I walk a lot of times in the street with the dog because I don't want him smelling or peeing on other people's property. So when he's on the asphalt, he doesn't pay attention. We go to the park or whatever, and we go to some place where it's the woods and so forth. And but in the meal, so I'm in the habit of kind of walking in the street, and there's a woman on the sidewalk. She's easily like 15, 20 feet aside from me. So as we're passing, we're not even close. And she sees me and I'm not wearing a mask outdoors on a nice day and all that kind of stuff. And she kind of like, points and so forth. And she's moving away from me like as if I'm the zombie apocalypse impersonated. And she winds up tripping on the edge of the grass,
Mm-hmm.
and she stumbles. And I start to go over to help her. She's like, and that's even worse. She wasn't going to have that. And I was mentioning that story. And one of the people in the office said, I was driving along, and woman, she tumbled off the side of the road, whatever, car's there. And I pulled over to, see what was going on. I forget exactly what the incident was. And he gets out of the car and she's like, starts screaming the same thing, like, no, stay away from me. And people, abjured help. They got in the situation where they're in their, I mean, it's really a sad thing that people, it's just, you can get people really scared and you can do things to them that it kind of boggles the mind. I mean, I think, we have all the, Library of Congress at our fingertips and all the information we want up to date and people, have videos all over the world. So, but it's kind of been startling to me how easy it is to fool everybody. This idea of wearing a mask outdoors or masking your young kids, and the risk stratification, as you mentioned earlier, was enormous. I think it was almost literally, 4 to 5 orders of magnitude, a good safe 5 orders of magnitude for a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old. If the 8-year-old's healthy and the 80-year-old's on a number of medications, and so to treat them equally, in terms of masks or vaccines or any of those things, was a vast overkill, no pun intended, and absurdity on a home basis. I mean, how have you navigated on behalf of your family and your relatives and so forth, both older and younger, and say age?
Yeah. Our kids, are younger, and when COVID hit, they were at a preschool that a private preschool that was very much following the government consensus at the time. And so they shut down, didn't give any refunds. They did like an hour or so a Zoom school, if that's what you want to call it, but doesn't really work for a 3-year-old or younger. It just doesn't. So we were, we were left kind of out in the cold. And then when they finally did return, they treated the kids as if they were radioactive. And so they were, they put our 2 kids who were 3 years apart in age in the same class, completely inappropriately, because they were worried that if they were in different classes, they doubled their exposure to deadly pathogens that may kill everybody. And then on top of that, they made them wear masks at all times, wouldn't allow them to consume any food or drink unless they were outside, far away from any other people, totally alone, and they only take off their mask in between sips and bites and then quickly put it back on. And then they wouldn't allow parents even to come onto campus. Parents would have to mask up, drive up to the school, text the teacher would come fully gowned and masked, sometimes with a face shield. And I saw one with gloves, take the kid out of the car once the kid was fully masked as well, and then race away as if the car is going to blow up. And then pickup was the same way. It just, none of this made any sense. And so, we questioned the school. You just questioned, we didn't even complain. We said, are there what's the basis for this? Is there any rationale? And they said, yes, we have a committee. We said, who's on the committee? And it was, people who were not physicians or scientists in any way, shape, or form. There was some kind of healer on the committee. That was the closest you had to a medical professional. They were taking this person's word over that of, two physician parents or anyone else for that matter. It was just ridiculous. So guess what happened? They kicked us out. They kicked our kids out. They said, we're not welcome there anymore. And they even said, you can't even come onto campus to pick up their belongings. You have to go to the security guard booth. That's where their stuff will be waiting. As if, we're gonna harm people by showing up to campus to pick up our kids, lunchbox or jacket or whatever else they had there. It's just ridiculous. And so what happened after that, this was a blessing in disguise. We found a preschool for them that has 12-foot high block walls, a large opaque metal gate with a guy heavily armed in front, whose job it is not to let anyone in from the outside, that said kids don't have to mask, teachers don't have to mask, people can do whatever they want. And guess what happened? People were fine. And if the health inspector showed up, they would tell them to get lost. And it was wonderful. And you know what? They went out of their way to allow the kids to have a normal life. And thanks to those people at that school, our kids had a very normal life. On top of that, we encouraged them to have play dates with other kids. Sure, if a kid had a cold or flu or COVID or whatever, they wouldn't go out and play dates. But that was already happening pre-COVID. So we just kept a normal life and everyone was fine.
People make fun of religion as being non-scientific, but I have to say that the religious schools throughout COVID did far better than the science-based agnostic public schools and so forth. And yet, we're supposed to consider the science when this was all done side by side. Locally, Catholic schools did not do any of this stuff, and I have not, noticed a vast diminishment, of Catholics locally. And frankly, I have online, an interview with a teacher at one of these schools, and her experience, because she had the same experience, but as a teacher, going from a masked school to a free school. If you ever seen that series, The Man in the High Castle,
yes.
There's kind of like at that point, I guess there are three Americas. There's Japanese controlled, Nazi controlled, and some kind of like free interland of
Yes.
kind of call it cowboy freedom America, and so people they don't go geographically so much. I mean, maybe it's just a mile or two, but there's like different worlds, and these worlds are coinciding, and yet it doesn't seem to explode anybody else's mind that they're not dropping dead. And over and over again, my video cast, I started doing this kind of radio free Corona. That's actually a better name than what I came up with. I should have go back in time and fix that. But I basically did radio free Corona because my kids are older. They're men, and they're adults and so forth. Their own households. So I didn't have the school thing per se. We have a goddaughter we've been watching, and she's gone through a lot of that stuff. But it's just an amazement. I was going to say that I kind of got ostracized from the groups I was in. Not the same thing as your school experience, but I have a squash player, so I have a tennis and squash club, and another tennis club, and this and that, and some other groups, and civic things, and a religious congregation, and all. I mean, I hate to say this because it sounds arrogant, but I'm used to being right. Like I score really high on my tests, and had no problem in schools. Things. I can kind of figure things out pretty well. Computer savvy and all that stuff. I learned how to read. I still remember how to read, and haven't forgotten how to read. And it's like, these things are all going on simultaneously, like the North Dakota, South Dakota. There were all kinds of experiments going on at the time. So the real science, such as it was population science. So like Sweden versus Belgium, and or sub-Saharan Africa versus Europe. I mean, there are lots of different experiments going on simultaneously. Like the virus doesn't seem to have done anything to sub-Saharan Africa. You don't hear about anything, and there could be reasons. It could be the populations, are younger. They don't have the same elderly cohort. It could be that they have the windows open because it's warm. I mean, there could be a number of reasons, and they're unvaccinated. They have not dropped dead. There are a lot of countries.
And they're of low socioeconomic background as well,
yeah,
right?
and so maybe my own personal theory is they've got bigger problems. They don't have time to fuss over this. If you're in Haiti, an example I heard in this video, it's crazy video because they mask themselves up. One's a clown, one's a chimp, so it looks idiotic, but they're making a lot of sense. So they're talking back and forth, and it's ludicrous. This is my critic, my dog, and they're talking about the island of Hispaniola, which is Haiti and Dominican Republic. So I'd never used that example. I wish I had. And same population, basically, same size, very similar size. And Haiti is like, nil, like 11% vaccinated, and had fewer fatalities than Dominican Republic, and so forth. There's a lot of these things, but the science, such as it is, shows that there's not that much science going on as far as the PPI and all these other, kind of lockdowns and mask downs and all these kind of things have been happening. And yet it's really hard to dissect the thing out. People have this kind of big social impetus to cohese, to kind of bring together and do what other people are doing. I feel it myself. I've been to, a congregation and at a time, like the windows open, it's freezing outside, and, they're going to get colds in other ways. And yet you have, anyway, I kind of had to take a break from that stuff because I'm probably a little more confrontational than you are, and I apologize, but that's what kind of way I was stamped. But it's just kind of a funny thing, and so a lot of my talking this out kind of came from getting shouted down by these other groups. I had letters, and it all started out very congenial, convivial, and all that kind of stuff. And like our tennis club kept everyone from playing tennis outdoors. It's like
crazy.
Please, and we have like MD, PhDs, MD, PhD, MPH. We got a whole bunch of suffixes, letter suffixes after people's names in the club, and lawyers and fund managers. We had a lot of super educated people playing squash and tennis, and I was kind of like this island. Maybe a couple other people who didn't really want to say it, but in the letters and so forth. And so I got shouted down. I'm going to maybe give you a tiny anecdote, but after this whole thing happened, a guy I'm more politically on the right, he's politically on the left, and he says, I hate that I had to agree with you, but you were right about everything. And it's like, dude, I mean, that's awesome. Thank you so much. But, I wish you'd said something. It's like, I could have used a little bit of moral support, but there's a lot of this. So after the fact, I'm hearing about it, everyone's like, yeah, I was with you the whole time. It's like, well, that's awesome. But, at the point where it matters, you have to stand up. And I appreciate that you do that. That's an awesome thing. We're just meeting today for the first time. But I like to commend and applaud the people who do that and take it upon themselves, because I don't think it's an easy.
Well, thank you. And you're doing the same. So.
Well, on a minor way, but that's anyway. I know you have some other things to do today. Busy guy such as you are. Perhaps I'm going to have the final word, but maybe you'd like to sum up maybe a note of what people should do in such circumstances. What is your advice? How do you get on? And what are your kind of general gestalt and feelings about how people can cope with circumstances such as this when they occur?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, and I guess I'll finish off by saying that I think the lesson that we've learned here is that we have to speak up. We can't be afraid, and I think the longer we silence ourselves out of fear or out of uncertainty, the tougher it's going to be to bail ourselves out of the mess that's going to be inevitably created. And so I think we have to encourage those around us to speak up. I think we have to set examples for others by speaking up and speaking up loudly. We can still be respectful, but at the same time, speaking up loudly and teaching our kids to do that, teaching our neighbors to do that, and trying to really constantly question everything around us. And if we don't, we risk losing the very freedoms that we so cherish, and I think which we still continue to take for granted in this country.
Well, that's true. And I know you have the last word, but I like to point out, my wife's again the classicist. I think the natural default position of mankind is in bondage. And as wonderful as her Greeks and Romans were, there was only a certain fraction of citizens, kind of like in Kuwait, perhaps today, that they're actual genuine citizens and actually have the full rights. And then there's a lot of Kuwait doesn't quite have slave labor, but Qatar and all these places, there's clearly a class system and a caste system as well. And you know, the liberal arts got its name in Rome as those things that, you know, rhetoric, reading, writing, and so forth that you needed. It was the trivium, actually. The trivium was the most important. There were the three, the trivium, the most important things for a free man to have and maintain. And they didn't have the internet, from what I understand, sad as it is to imagine. But they needed reading, you know, rhetoric, discussion, and writing, and arithmetic, mathematics. They needed to know basically the things that they could, you know, suss out and figure out the political and dynamic and strategic landscape. And we actually all have that. Almost everybody you'll meet on a professional basis has a liberal arts education on some level. And whether those arts have been maintaining the liberating aspect, and whether liberals from the same root word, you know, care about freedom, is an open question. So I appreciate your time on this, and I'm not going to keep you much longer, but I do like, as I always do, to give a blurb for myself, and I apologize for involving you here. But this is my book, Overturning Zika, The Pandemic That Never Was. It's being published in Brazil by a major publisher in the next couple of weeks, I believe. It has not quite permeated the consciousness here because it's a past pandemic. We didn't really have Zika here, but there's a lot to know in its disappearance, because it was there and then it's gone. It was a big pandemic and everyone's like all roiled up about it. You couldn't fly to Rio and all this kind of stuff. And they had, 250,000 troops on the streets in Brazil. A lot of stuff going on. And so it was kind of, I don't think it was a test run for COVID-19 because nobody knew that was coming, but there were a lot of the same things happening, and the science was never really there. That's why it never recurred. And thank God for that, because microcephaly is a horrible thing for, any given child. It's extremely limiting and worse than COVID in a sense. But anyway, so I'm going to let you go.
Great.
End the broadcast unless you have any last words.
No, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it. And happy to do it again.
All right, perfect.
All right, Randy, take care.
Yeah.
Thank you.